The square. When we're solving a certain quadratic, one of the processes that we can do is called completing the square. Essentially, what we will be doing is to create a perfect square. And this is just a process to help us, again, to solve quadratics. So let's go ahead and set some steps off here to the side, and then we'll reference these steps as we go. Number one, the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure a equals 1, and we may need to divide if necessary. We're going to write out all these steps. If some of them don't make sense, we'll keep referencing them as we work the problems. I just want to kind of have this basis before we get started. Number 2, we're going to move our C value to the other side. Number 3, we are going to add half of b squared to both sides. All these a, b's, and c's are the same a, b's, and c's from our standard form that we mentioned earlier with quadratics. And so when we add half of b squared to both sides, we are looking at b over 2, that's half, and squared. Step number 4, we are going to rewrite as a perfect square. And then step number 5, we are going to solve by extracting the square. And so these steps over here to the side, we are going to definitely reference as we go about. So I just want to kind of set those up before we ever get going. Okay, so let's look at this example and let's make sense of this. Okay, so first thing, we are looking at things being in standard form, that ax squared plus bx plus c. So when we're referencing these a, b's, and c's, we're talking about the coefficients or the constant term. And so step number 1 says to make sure that a equals 1. And when there is not a number written there, that's an assumed 1. So step number 1, we're good to go. Step number 2, move c to the other side. Well, c is that plus 1. So for step number 2, I'm going to say minus 1 on both sides. That gives me x squared plus 6x equal to negative 1. Step number 3, add half of b squared to both sides. So we're going to have to do a small calculation here. So in our example, our b is 6. So we're going to do half of 6, so 6 over 2 squared, and that would be equal to 3 squared or 9. So for step number 3, we're going to add that value of 9 to both sides. And so I would say x squared plus 6x plus 9 equal to negative 1 plus 9. Since I'm adding 9 to both sides, the problem is staying equivalent. So I'll go ahead and clean that up. That gives me x squared plus 6x plus 9 equal to, and on that right side, we have a positive 8. Step number 4, rewrite as a perfect square. Well, if we take what we've now created on the left-hand side, that actually factors, because we chose 9, right? Very strategic. That factors into x plus 3 and x plus 3. And you can see that 3 times 3 would give us a 9. And then if we multiplied the 3x and the x3, that would add to give us a 6x. So I could write this more compactly, and I could say, well, then that's x plus 3 squared equal to 8. What you'll notice through this trend is this 3 right here is always going to be your b over 2 value. So you can see that here. This b over 2 was equal to 3. That's what's landing right here, or more specifically right here in the parentheses. Now, that was step number 4, rewrite as a perfect square. And then number 5 is solve by extracting the square. So in order to extract that square, I would take the x plus 3 squared equal to 8. I would square root both sides. So that gives me x plus 3 equal to plus or minus the square root of 8. And we could reduce that square root of 8 into 2 square roots of 2 just by doing our prime factor tree. And then subtract 3 from both sides. So x would be equal to negative 3 plus or minus 2 square roots of 2. So completing the square has its time and place. Not only can it solve, but it can do other things in other realms and application. Right here, right now, we're just using it to solve a quadratic. So definitely not going to leave you hanging. We're going to do another example. And we're just going to use these same steps that we had. You have them written in your notes here to work this next problem. Okay, so step number 1 is make sure that your a is equal to 1. So since we do not have an a equal to 1, our a is 2, I'm going to create that into a 1, and I would do that by dividing by 2. So that means I'm going to have to divide everything by 2. So that gives me x squared minus 2x minus 5 equal to 0. Step number 2 says to move c to the other side. So in step number 2, I'm going to add this 5 to both sides to move the c over. That gives me x squared minus 2x equal to 5. Step number 3, add half of b squared to both sides. This is where our small calculation is going to come into play. So I'm going to take this negative 2, I'm going to divide it by 2 and square it. So it gives me negative 1 squared, which is positive 1. So for step number 3, I'm going to add that value to both sides. And so I'm going to say x squared minus 2x, I'm going to say plus 1 equals 5, and then plus an additional 1 on the other side again. As long as we do it to both sides, we haven't changed the problem. So I'm going to clean that up. That gives me x squared minus 2x plus 1 equal to 4. Step number 4, rewrite as a perfect squared. And we saw in that previous example, when we go to do the rewrite, that is going to be our 2 parentheses with x and x. And then it's going to be this term right here, this negative 2 over 2 each time, or that b over 2. And so that means I would have minus 1 in both of those spots equal to 4. So that would give me x minus 1 squared equal to 4. And then lastly, step number 5 says to solve by extracting the square. So I would square root both sides to give me x minus 1 equal to plus or minus. This one reduces down to 2. And then I would have to add 1 to that value. Oh, excuse me. Messed up my calculation there. Hopefully you caught that as well. 5 plus 1 is 6. I was working with the wrong number over there. That didn't square root down nicely. So plus or minus the square root of 6. Add that 1. That gives me x equal to 1 plus or minus 6. And so I could either write that together nicely in our notes, or when you go online, 1 plus the square root of 6, comma 1 minus the square root of 6. So it is going to take some practice walking through the different processes and steps, but it's definitely something that you can do. So completing the square is just another way to solve a quadratic.